This week on the Newscast podcast on BBC Sounds, we've been discussing President Trump's very controversial new national security strategy for the USA. And we got this verdict from a former national security advisor to the UK.
It overturns 70 years of US foreign policy, in effect.
President Trump also launched a scathing attack on the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan.
If you take a look at London, you have a mayor named Khan. He's a horrible mayor. He's an incompetent mayor, but he's a horrible, vicious, disgusting mayor.
In response, Sadiq Khan said that Donald Trump is obsessed with him. And this week we became obsessed with the World Cup draw. So much so that we're trying to find a newscaster from every single country that will be going to Canada, the USA and Mexico for the World Cup next summer. If you want to hear how we're getting on in our global search, you can scan the QR code right now, which will take you to the daily episodes of Newscast on BBC Sounds. But here is tonight's episode of Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And Chris in the studio.
And Alex in the studio.
And Faisal in the studio.
I've just realised we haven't got a Christmas tree this year.
How miserable.
Normally we do have a Christmas tree. I mean, we've got regular foliage, but that's not like
You could
festive
just
foliage.
put some baubles on your plants.
Our tinsel is green.
Minimalist
No
Christmas
Christmas.
this year.
Bah humbug.
Now, this is our last show on BBC One of this year. We'll be back in the new year, you'll be pleased to hear. And normally, as is tradition in news and journalism, we'd be reflecting on how the government's done this year. Mm-hmm. But we don't have to because Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, has done it for us in a wide-ranging interview in the new Statesman. And he ain't happy.
No, he says he's frustrated, and he did the thing that many a minister who has ambition does, which is to stray a little bit beyond their ministerial brief. This wasn't a interview that was entirely focused on the ups and downs of the National Health Service, it's fair to say. So he talked about being frustrated. He talked about the government being seen as, it was a problem if the government was seen as the maintenance department of the country, which is quite an arresting phrase.
Because it sounds like you're just tinkering or patching things up.
Well, yeah, and it's sort of not, I suppose it's the point that it's not to denigrate the role of a maintenance department, but nobody's enthused by maintenance departments. And he was suggesting that, you know, if that's how you're perceived, the danger is that an alternative, or perhaps, as he put it, cheaper maintenance department comes along. And people think, well, why not give that a go? Because maybe that's, if they're going to maintain, then they're cheaper, then why not go for that? In other words, that sense of, you know, his critique being a lack of storytelling, a lack of vision. Yes, I mean, it absolutely had a sense of here is a party, including some prominent senior individuals within it, who are sketching out, quite often in private and certainly in public, a critique of, and therefore, frankly, an alternative vision of how Labour might govern, either under its current leadership or under a different one.
We'll come on to the vision bit in a second, but Alex, that is not a very coded attack on Keir Starmer, the whole maintenance guy thing.
Well, Wes Streeting, for whatever anybody thinks about him, is a smart, astute politician who understands politics. And the context to him giving this interview with those comments and critiques of how he thinks the government's doing at the moment is a very active conversation about leadership and Keir Starmer's leadership and what role Wes Streeting may or may not play in any future leadership of the Labour Party. So I don't think for a second you can read that without having the awareness that Wes Streeting himself would have been well full in the knowledge that he was making those comments that would have been perceived through the lens of, is Keir Starmer the right leader for the Labour Party and the Labour government right now? And so, you know, interpret as you will, it would have been done knowingly.
And Faisal, the bit he says, decode this for us. He says, we can't talk about the bond market, so the people that lend the government money, as a binary choice between helplessness and recklessness.
Yeah,
What do you
well,
think he's
obviously,
getting at there?
well, I think, sort of infamously around the Labour Party conference, there was obviously a little bit of excitement about Andy Burnham, which then got somewhat squashed because of similar sort of analogous comments. I would say Burnham's comments were slightly harder.
What was it, in hock to the bond market?
You don't want to be in hocked about bond markets. This is a sort of lighter version of that. I think if we take a step back,
Basically, in other words, borrow loads more money because you don't need to worry about that.
well,
stuff.
no, but is it a bit more subtle? It actually is what Burnham was trying to say, a bit more subtle as well, which is that if you're a government that sort of defines itself by what you can't do rather than what you can do, like the voters who are more important or as important as the bond markets are going to start to notice that. and I think it goes with this thing about the technocrats that he said and the maintenance, that there would have been expectations like beyond the kind of core swing voters in this election, which obviously we talk about a lot as being kind of the sort of reform-leaning red wall, whatever we call it these days. That there's also like a hinterland of Labour voters that might have expected a bit more oomph from a party that had, however thin and wide that was, a majority which varies from time to time, but about 150 plus, right? And it goes back to some of the conversations we've had about the Office of Budget Responsibility and its power, which is this sort of same thing as the OBR here. But like, who's in charge here? Like, who's in charge? And I think that's probably the question that he's posing, and is being posed on the left. It's been posed on the right. I think what's really interesting from what I've seen of Labour is that question about the OBR more than the bond markets is also being posed from the centre of the Labour Party now, from like the Good Growth group, the guys that were standing against Jeremy Corbyn in Islington. So there's obviously quite a wide-ranging conversation. It's interesting that Streeting thinks that he can lean in that direction. I think it just shows maybe the country does want a bit of positivity and optimism after years of crisis and chaos. Or that's what he feels anyway.
I was talking to someone random the other day, senior figure in the Labour Party, who was saying, I won't insult your intelligence by implying that there isn't campaigning going on left, right and centre. Now,
and they meant left, right and centre as in everywhere, not the political makeup of the Labour
Party.
Although
a bit of that as well.
There's a bit of that. Anyway, carry on.
Albeit, to be clear, with a pretty small c, not a capital C, but in terms of it just being a constant strand of conversation. I was talking to somebody else because we're in the middle of the absolute thick of Christmas party and Christmas
Good of you to be with us.
Yeah, no, I know. It's quite nice to have a night off, actually. Shall I tell this? I'm going to tell
Go
this story. I'm going off slightly off piste here, but so last night I was at various drink stews, and
last night was peak night, I think, wasn't it? There was something like about 5.
There was a lot, and I waited until 10 o'clock. Therefore, beyond the point where I was not going to be called to go on the 10 o'clock news before I drank anything particularly strong. But after 10 o'clock, I thought I'd have a few beers. And we're moving from one place to the next, and it's genuinely journalistically really useful. But there's also a bit of Christmas spirit about it. Anyway, I'm on my way home at the wrong side of midnight, and I get halfway home, and I need the loo basically. This is not a.
You didn't do a Peter Mandelson.
No, this is not a Peter Mandelson. I was at a tube station which had station that had a gents' toilet. Anyway, I barrel in there, and who do I bump into? Ian Watson, BBC political correspondent, who's been to a different set of parties, and he's also caught short.
Right.
Anyway, so just give you some sense of the enterprise.
Oh, I thought you were going to say then you gleaned some massive political story from bumping into him.
We did compare.
Wes Streeting didn't wash his hands.
We did compare notes around all of this. I can't remember what was I about to say before I embarked on this.
You tell me.
People campaigning left, right, and centre, but not politically,
and with a small c.
With a small c.
I had that was it. I had a conversation at one of these stews last night from someone who is sort of politics adjacent and turns up at these things, and is often tapped up by politicians for advice around this person's specialism. And they were saying they get loads of calls at the moment from people effectively acting on behalf of or adjacent to or outriders for, sometimes it may be even more than one potential, but in other words, talking about what the prospectus of a candidate or candidates might be were there to be a contest, and how far it would be reasonable to move away from a manifesto, because obviously any leader, were there to be a contest or were the Prime Minister to move on, wouldn't have their own mandate in the way that Keir Starmer does. So it's just when you start piecing together the different strands of these. Now, a lot of this you could accurately describe as fervent conversation that might not go anywhere. And that, of course, Keir Starmer will make an argument that it's his majority and it's his mandate. And do you really want to plunge the party into a process in government of selecting a new year? And sometimes I think in all of the journalistic noise that there is about the Prime Minister's future, we perhaps underprice the thought that in a year's time, he might very well still be there. Because it's one heck of a thing to turf a Prime Minister out or for a Prime Minister to choose to go. But anyway, it is the talk of these Christmas do's and the conversation and the small c campaigning, which I think you could slot that New Statesman article interview fairly clearly into, is everywhere.
But what I don't understand about is, if talking about prospectuses, like what Wes Streeting was meant to be unveiling about himself in this interview that we didn't know about already. Like, we know that he's from a very humble background. We know that he wants a lot of economic growth. I didn't feel that there was extra bits of vision in there that weren't there.
It's the placement, though, isn't it? Front page of the New Statesman. Yeah. It's a statement. People probably read more of that magazine over the subscribers over the Christmas period when they've got time.
Also, as Alex says, if you're the Health Secretary, you don't have to do things like this. You're very
busy,
nice of you.
Busy time for the NHS right
now.
No,
you could say, well, it's very kind of you, New Statesman, to invite, to offer to, do an interview, but I'm very busy, and he's chosen to do it.
He was trying to articulate with some of what he was saying in there. I think he was trying to articulate what he perceives as the concern of some of the Labour MPs about Keir Starmer, and suggesting he wouldn't be the same were that to come eventually. So that stuff around the kind of, maintenance department, that sort of slight jibe, but maybe a technocratic style, as some people might see it, that Keir Starmer's had, the inability to fire people up or to, I think Wes Streeting is attempting, although obviously he categorically would deny on the record that he's got his eyes on the top job and that, there's no vacancy available and that Keir Starmer's going to be there forever.
We know that that's his position. Of the government and all that.
Absolutely. But I think he's trying to tap into the sense that some Labour MPs, lots of Labour MPs have, which is that the government's failed to tell its story properly, that it hasn't had enough kind of leadership from the front around that. And I think he's trying to say, I get that, and perhaps I could, were it to come up, do something a little bit different.
And the issue that I think may crystallise. The question I pose is...
We can hear your gilet rustling, by the way.
Okay, well, there podcast.
Sorry, there we go. Full tech, Christmas tech, bro.
The question I pose is this, which is the extent to which this dynamic starts to mimic kind of symmetrically what we got with the Conservatives and UKIP, with the Greens kind of nipping at the heels of Labour all the way up to May, and whether that starts to fire quite different conversations that we thought were...
Reform rather than UKIP. I wasn't sure if you were making a big...
So no, when it was UKIP, it was UKIP did to the Tories, right?
Yeah. Oh, I see.
Well, you get the same sort of dynamic, which then... And I pose this to you two, really, which is if that then motivates entirely different conversations and sort of braver conversations, like we're starting to see this like rustling around on Europe a bit.
Yeah.
I heard from someone pretty senior in government saying all of us have not clocked what Trump has done with this like national security strategy and whether this totally changes the game. These sorts of things could get quite interesting quite quickly with this different set of kind of political boundaries, I guess, and the dynamic where Starmer and Reeves had to look behind them at what the Green Party is doing.
Well, do you know what? I'm glad you mentioned the national security strategy. I've clocked it quite comprehensively on Newscast this week on BBC Sounds. Listen to the back catalogue.
I made that defence.
What have we not been clocking?
Well, the idea that this might be a fundamentally different America and an approach to Europe, and many of the example that I was given was the La Repubblica in Italy devoted the first 7 pages to what they saw as a total change. And I think La Repubblica is that on the centre left. I can't quite. I'm not that expert on Italian newspapers, but still, that it was a fundamental change to the transatlantic pact, which was the attack not just on Europe, not just a sort of dissent that Europe has maybe gone in a different direction in terms of politics, but like an absolute criticism of its internal politics in a way that would be unacceptable the other way around. Clearly unacceptable the other way around. So does this raise real questions about our assumptions about how
because basically this document says in black and white that the American government wants patriotic political parties, in its words, that represent kind of classic Europe, like read white, Judeo-Christian, to succeed in elections in Europe. That's what you mean when you talk about potential political interference.
I think there's all sorts of, I think from what I'm hearing in my sphere, in things like tech and economics and on the growth strategies, that they say now that they've got this constant hamster wheel of trying to get the headroom in the right place that was affecting them every week, they feel that they can park that for several months. They're going to try and do some bold stuff in the new year. Like they say this all the time, but I was very struck because the party I went to, or the event I went to, was the Tony Blair Institute, and I haven't seen much of, in my area, I haven't seen much of Shabana Mahmood, but I thought it was extraordinary to see. What's Tony Blair giving his kind of endorsement to Shabana Mahmood.
Did she just RSVP yes?
I don't know, but it was quite something.
Right.
Cheering from the sort of Blairite crowd
Of her.
It was
Specifically.
I was quite struck, and I haven't seen as much as you have of her, but like her sort of fluent narrative about the Labour Party can't make arguments around fairness, or has to engage the good spirit of the British people, and has to do so through setting very strict rules. And she convinced that audience, and certainly Blair seemed pretty up.
Well, that's the Blair playbook, isn't it?
Up on it. It is, but like I would have thought that he'd like older hands than me suggested it wasn't the full ringing endorsement that you got there, and I would have imagined, I don't know what you think, that he would have been more, if you had to pick someone that of the runners and riders, I don't know if we're at runners and riders stage, he'd be more a Streetingite, I don't know.
But I think all of this is, I think these are all sort of reasonable questions that are sometimes quite hard to drive to a definitive conclusion on, but you just piece together the last 5 minutes of our conversation. You've got the Wes Streeting and the New Statesman, you've got Shabana Mahmood at the Tony Blair event. Now, of course, it's pre-Christmas and people do these kind of interviews and go to these kind of do's, but this is the stuff, and this is the stuff that's happening in public. Yeah. Let alone all the stuff that's going on privately. And interesting on that point about what we've seen from Washington, and then that wider conversation about the customs union, or if you like, the posture of the UK government towards the European Union. What's fascinating there is that we had a week in which the Prime Minister chose, a couple of times on one day, a week last Monday, to sort of talk up his sort of pro-European credentials within the tram tracks of the red lines that
what he was doing already,
not joining the customs union, single market, freedom of movement, etc. When you've had the Liberal Democrats and others making that argument that is exactly what should happen. And then this week I thought almost, not quite step back from it, because arguably they weren't really stepping all that further forward than they were anyway, but certainly in the little conversation, what's known as the huddle after Prime Minister's questions this week, there was an absolute emphasis from the spokespeople on what they see as the merits of their current posture, which has allowed the deal with India and the deal with the US. So, okay.
That's not what they were really stressing last week.
No, you can argue that this is sort of subtleties of how far you lean in one direction or another.
Because they thought that the pro-European stuff had gone a bit too far and they wanted to...
I don't think that. In that they were clearly defining when they were doing their pro-European lean what they regarded as the limits of what
I see. So nothing that would jeopardise the prosperity deal with the United States.
No, exactly. But it was just how degrees of emphasis one week were in one direction and another were in another.
But Starmer was pretty robust about it in PMQs, actually,
on
record.
But this is the point, right? If the stuff that we're talking about the other runners and riders becomes real, it becomes a very live issue, doesn't it?
And this is exactly
a very, very live issue.
And this is exactly the point. So when I was kicking around, why did he run up that? It wasn't even a hill, really. He just lent it. He just chose to. He chose to use sort of pro-European vocabulary twice in the same day, and a couple of occasions around it. I think he did it in his Guardian piece on that Monday morning as well. And then this week there was a bit more, perhaps back in the other direction, albeit without actually changing policy at all, really. Yeah. I think you have to sit it in the context of that thing I was saying about the conversations that are going on in the wider Labour Party about what its future posture might look like, even beyond this Parliament, by the way, the others going into another general election, around customs union or other things.
I just think it's obviously the conversations that are active and consistent about leadership and what may or may not happen over the course of the next few months or year or whatever it is, which are real. I think all that is really doing is crystallising the issue that has been there, existing for Labour for some time, and perhaps has formed part of the backdrop to the challenge that Keir Starmer's had in his first however many 18 months of government, is that, the kind of, whether you want to call it a threat or a challenge, but the existence of the left or the soft left in Labour has always been there, and he ran headlong into it around things like welfare and, two-child benefit cap. But that's always been there. So has the sort of, more centre-left aspect of the Labour Party. And you wonder if Keir Starmer and perhaps some of the way that they have wrestled with issues in government over the course of the last 18 months and ran into resistance from their own party so brutally quite early in a big majority term government is as a consequence of the fact they weren't ever really clear on how they were going to hang that electoral coalition they won in 2024, but also the differences within a big parliamentary Labour Party together. And I think the conversations around leadership and the challenge from the parties of the left and the right through the Greens and now Reform, they're just crystallising that existing challenge, which had seemingly not been resolved.
Although the way they papered over that during the election was to say we'll get amazing economic growth, which means we'll be able to do everything that we want to please everyone.
Yes.
And guess what? Wes Streeting's vision is for amazing economic growth, which means you can redistribute more. It's like, it's just the same again, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which then brings you back to, I was talking to a Labour MP this afternoon who is pretty sceptical about the current leadership and deeply aware of the predicament that the government finds itself in terms of popularity, but was saying, but it's that point. The other side of let's imagine a scenario where there is a contest and all the rest of it, and as I say, let's not underprice the scenario where there isn't, but where there is, and someone new comes along and there's a bit of a row and then they plump for someone and there's a certain amount of excitement and they might be better or worse on this, that and the other than Keir Starmer, but a lot of the fundamentals are just the same and they don't have a mandate.
And the challenge, the other bit of all of this, of course, that you have to remember is the mechanics for there to be a leadership contest in the Labour Party are really, really tricky. So you need a whole load of MPs to think that there would have to be. Secondly, that there isn't a kind of one obvious candidate that's standing out. Thirdly, Keir Starmer's been pretty clear at this stage, at least, that he ain't going nowhere, thanks, guys. And fourthly, I just wonder, and I'm sure these conversations are happening equally, they are, is that how much you have to factor in the public tolerance for a party that changes leader on the back of fresh memories of the previous party, the Conservatives, that changed leader so rapidly, and how that did not persuade anybody publicly that they kind of had the answers to the country. So that has to be baked into the calculations as well. And I think it is being.
So I think that they'll be very carefully hoping the economic numbers go in their direction.
Yeah.
And one of the things from the budget, which was kind of undercooked afterwards, was the idea that they've actually physically kind of intervened with the inflation rate. So it's higher than it was going to be, but it's still 0.4 percentage points lower. And the Bank of England backed that up to go 0.5% less. It's quite interesting now. That means that the inflation rate, if they're right, will be below 2.5% by April. And we will not hear the end of it from them.
And another interest rate cut just before Christmas, and all the numbers on net migration look like net migration has already plunged quite a lot. It's going to plunge even further, and actually maybe the conversations we're having in a year's time will quite different.
And so that is true. But I was also struck by sort of deja vu when I heard about this customs union vote that happened. And was it 10 Labour MPs that voted?
So this was a little parliamentary manoeuvre that was never going to get anywhere legislatively.
It passed.
It was the Lib Dems trying to propose a customs union.
But I've always thought there's always like key indicators, and these things start small and then they get big, don't they? I mean, all the ones that we had to cover in 2019, they start small to get big. And I just thought, Meg Hillier, the Treasury Select Committee chair, has voted for this. Right in the middle of the party, sensible, probably would have been a minister, and she's voted for this. And someone said to me, well, you've got to understand that London MPs are under a lot of pressure, and London councils in May, there's some quite interesting predictions.
There's some really.
Well, I'll let you do it, because how credible people are
also,
saying.
if only I'd asked her when I bumped into her going to buy my Christmas tree 2 weeks ago, I could have got the scoop on that. But never mind.
Right. But the London MPs are very worried apparently about the London councils. I don't know if
massively so. So ahead of the elections next May, so devolved elections in Scotland and Wales and elections to loads of local authorities in England, there's obviously a big focus, rightly, on Scotland and Wales electing devolved governments. Someone said to me the other day, do not underprice London for 3 reasons. Number one, half of Labour's membership lives in London. So how the result is in London will perhaps disproportionately shape their view about the party's predicament. And number two, maybe there are only 2 points. I was trying to think what the third was as I embarked on the second one. Number two, there is a 3 points. Number two is the vast majority of MPs in London are Labour. Yeah. So again, they will feel the results. Number three is that Labour within London, and obviously London is big and is politically diverse in many senses, Labour are likely to face challenges from almost everywhere on the political spectrum, whether it's Reform, Greens, Conservatives, Liberal Democrats. In other words, so this person was saying to me, their fear is, come the day after, the collective mood amongst London Labour, which is big and significant, could be one of not only this is terrible, but the
We're clobbered from every direction.
Yeah, and there won't therefore necessarily be a consensus on what the solution is.
Which comes back to that whole problem is it has, when they won in 2024, Keir Starmer almost had, it obviously sounds strange to frame it as a problem when they've just won a stonking great majority, but a similar challenge to Boris Johnson in 2019 when they'd somehow managed to hang together quite a disparate electoral coalition with people with quite different views on stuff around one sort of central theme. And for 2019 for Boris Johnson, it was obviously get Brexit done. In 2024 for Keir Starmer, you could argue that they were the obvious alternative to the Conservatives and people were fed up with the Conservatives in government. But beyond that, what do you then do? And I think that has sort of been the underlying theme that's been running through the past 18 months and maybe why we've seen some policy shifts and moves around some of the key central issues because they haven't quite worked out how to deal with that.
I'm fascinated about this in the early weeks of the new year. What do Labour decide to run with, if you like, as their theme, their story for the first 5 months of next year when you're heading into these hugely important elections? What's going to be the kind of controlling thought? Now, I think, as we always tend to do in the early weeks of the year, the early days of the new year, you'll have the Prime Minister and others coming out and doing those sort of New Year kind of speech or news conference or event or whatever, where there is that kind of sketching. But I think that's going to be fascinating, and the extent to which he attempts to address this recurring criticism, which Wes Streeting has aligned himself with in this interview around the maintenance department, around the storytelling, around the kind of vision thing or the kind of this is what we're about.
Let's do a very quick bit of further future gazing. Chris, you pointed our attention to the London elections and how they could be very significant. Alex, give us something to keep an eye on.
You've got to say the elections in Scotland and Wales, which also will be massive and really significant. Largely, I think, judged through the prism of how Labour does in those elections, because obviously Labour has been in power in Wales forever and ever and ever, and Labour at one point in the not too distant past were hoping to take control in Holyrood. So there's a huge question mark over the Labour performance, but also what will be interesting to see how the other parties fare, not least Plaid and Reform in Wales. And of course, those elections matter, not just because it's about people choosing their representatives with all the consequences of that for the course of the next few years. That is important in and of itself. But for me, sitting where we're sitting, that is the absolutely crucial inflection point of the next 12 months when it comes to determining everything we've discussed, about Keir Starmer and his government beyond that.
Wales, I think is it's going to be fascinating.
I'm going to pick the mood and confidence of the country, right? Because I think Labour promised just calm, and it wasn't politically calm, I think it's fair to say. But now they think they've got the foundations in place for some economic calm, which should yield some fruits if it's going to work. And so the proof point for this, which is I'm slightly obsessed with, is that there is some quite good news happening in the UK kind of tech sector and quantum computing and AI, and you should be able to see that. Now that won't change loads of votes everywhere, but it might start to show that the UK has a decent stake in the future world economy, kind of closer to the consumer in terms of their confidence and mood. I can't say further than the World Cup. That could absolutely transform everything. When England play Scotland in the final.
Unlikely.
That's your prediction.
Having watched the whole draw programme last week, it's going to be hilarious. Even forget the sport, just the fact that it's in America in this moment and how they're going to do it. That programme's serious. My highlight will be, I hope this happens, Katy Perry and Justin Trudeau getting engaged. Pop and politics meeting.
I assumed that was AI, and then someone said, "No, this is a problem now." Everything on social media, I'm like, if it's too good to be true, it's AI. I just assumed that was made up.
No,
and now
I can see. I'm just imagining the sort of newscast special at that moment, where live from Toronto or whatever.
Adam's going to be there, sure.
Well, exactly.
Right? You've got to go.
Going to get an invite. Going to get an invite.
Yeah.
What if it's the day England are playing Scotland in the final, though? Maybe it could be in Toronto. Well, hopefully the wedding's in the morning and the final's in the afternoon.
Sorted.
Bob's your uncle. Right, that's all for Newscast on your screens on BBC One for this year. We will be back in January. If you'd like to listen to podcast editions of Newscast on BBC Sounds every day, there's a QR code on your screen now which you can scan, which will take you to Newscast on BBC Sounds, where you can get analysis like this every single day of the week. Although not all the episodes will include thrilling anecdotes about going from Christmas party to Christmas party and then needing the toilet on the way home. But thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye.